Mm-hmm. Hmm. Hi, buddy. Hi, buddy. You gonna hang out with me? No color options for the text. Ah, there we go. Maybe? Hey, get out of there. Hey, if you're gonna go up there, you're gonna have to leave the room, buddy. Hmm. Hello, Lady Omnia. Is it showing up? Aha. Aha. Hello. I think we can make this bigger. Loud and clear, Captain. What are you doing, buddy? What are you doing over there? Position. Okay. That's going to be fine for now. Wait, is it? Settings. Oof. Chat. All right, you can see the chat. Are the messages permanent or do they go away? Let's make them a little bigger. All right, buddy. Love you, buddy. All right, I had to chase the cat away. She was being a little terrorist, as she does. Okay. Almost. Good news, our bitrate is holding strong. Elmar Abrego Garcia notified by ICE that he may be deported to Uganda. Eric Trump plans to visit Japan in September, Bloomberg News reports. Pentagon restricts Ukraine's use of U.S. missiles against Russia, Wall Street Journal reports. Ghislaine Maxwell tells Deputy Attorney General she doesn't believe Jeffrey Epstein died by suicide. Texas lawmakers give final approval to Trump-backed election map, sending it to the governor. Ooh, the Menendez brothers denied parole. European postal services suspend shipment of packages to U.S. over tariffs, just like the U.S. postal services. Hold on, we got to read that one. All right. Hello, both my viewers. How are you guys tonight? All right, on August 23rd, 2025, U.S. authorities informed Kilmar Abrego Garcia that they intend to remove him from the country to Uganda and directed him to check in at ICE's Baltimore office. This development follows Abrego Garcia's mistaken deportation to El Salvador in March 2025, despite a 2019 immigration judge's order shielding him due to persecution fears. Abrego Garcia, an undocumented Salvadoran who denies gang ties, was returned to U.S. custody, charged with human smuggling, and recently released from a Tennessee jail en route to Maryland. A court filing on Saturday contended that the attempt to send him back to Uganda exemplifies prosecutorial retaliation, while his attorneys maintain that no evidence linking him to gang activity has been provided by the government. The potential deportation to Uganda, a third country with a recent U.S. deportation agreement, suggests continued legal and immigration challenges from Abrego Garcia amid evolving enforcement policies. Oops. Remember, Kilmar Garcia was the one. See a photo of MS-13 hands. Kilmar is the one who had these tattoos on his fingers, which might mean MS-13. Maybe. We don't know. I don't know. But Trump held up this picture. Oh, not this picture. I don't have access to the Wall Street Journal. This picture. Oh my God. Just give me the picture. And tried to say that he had the letters MS-13 tattooed on him. Those are clearly photoshopped letters. Sky News UK. Lawyers for Kilmar Abrego Garcia said in a filing that ICE officials offered the 29-year-old deportation to Costa Rica in exchange for pleading guilty to human smuggling charges and remaining in prison. Sunday, 24th of August. Oh, this was reported 4 hours from now. A man who was wrongly deported to El Salvador by the Trump administration has been threatened with removal again, according to a court filing by his lawyers. Originally came from El Salvador, he has been charged in an indictment filed in federal court in Tennessee with conspiring to transport illegal immigrants into the U.S. He was released from federal detention on Friday after being held since March, when he was arrested and then deported back to his home country by ICE officials. In a new filing to the Tennessee court on Saturday, Mr. Garcia's defense lawyers said that immigration officials threatened the 29-year-old with deportation to Uganda earlier this week. According to the filing, while he was held in Putnam County Jail on Thursday, Mr. Garcia declined an offer to be deported to Costa Rica in exchange for pleading guilty to human smuggling charges and remaining in prison. After he left jail on Friday, ICE notified his attorneys that he would be deported to Uganda and should report to immigration authorities on Monday. That same day, the Trump administration informed Mr. Abrego that he has until first thing Monday morning, precisely when he must report to ICE's Baltimore field office, to accept a plea in exchange for deportation to Costa Rica, or else that offer will be off the table forever. Filed along with the brief was a letter from the Costa Rican government stating that Mr. Garcia would be welcomed to that country as a legal immigrant and wouldn't face the possibility of detention. Justice Department spokesperson Chad Gilmartin responded in a statement and said a federal grand jury has charged Abrego Garcia with serious federal crimes, underscoring the clear danger this defendant presents to the community. This defendant can plead guilty and accept responsibility or stand trial before a jury. Either way, we will hold Abrego Garcia accountable and protect the American people. Simon Sandoval Moschenberg, one of Mr. Garcia's attorneys, said he would fight tooth and nail against any form of deportation to Uganda or nearby countries in Africa. It is preposterous that they would send him to Africa, to a country where he doesn't even speak the language, a country with documented human rights violations, when there are so many other options, he said. His family has suffered enough. However, Mr. Sandoval Moschenberg appeared to suggest that deportation to Costa Rica might be favorable for his client, saying, "That's a pretty reasonable option, right? I mean, Costa Rica makes sense. It's a Spanish-speaking country, it's proximate to the United States, his family can visit him there easily." Mr. Garcia, who lived in Maryland with his American wife and son, was deported to El Salvador under a controversial 18th century law. He was then imprisoned in its notorious maximum security terrorism confinement center, CICOT. This was despite an immigration judge's 2019 order granting him protection from deportation after finding he was likely to be persecuted by local gangs if he was returned to his native country. Democrat Senator Chris Van Hollen, who met Mr. Garcia in CICOT, said the 29-year-old was traumatized by the experience. The Trump administration admitted that deporting Mr. Garcia was an administrative error, but said at the time that they could not bring him back as they do not have jurisdiction over El Salvador. After eventually returning him to the U.S. in June, the Trump administration detained Mr. Garcia on criminal charges that were filed in May. The criminal indictment alleges Mr. Garcia worked with at least 5 co-conspirators to bring immigrants to the U.S. illegally and transport them from the border to other destinations in the country. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, U.S. President Donald Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and other officials claim Mr. Garcia was a member of MS-13, an international criminal gang formed by immigrants who had fled El Salvador's civil war to protect Salvadoran immigrants from rival gangs. Mr. Garcia's lawyers strongly deny the claims. Claims that Donald Trump's administration used the threat of deportation to Uganda to force him to plead guilty. Pentagon restricts Ukraine's use of U.S. missiles against Russia, Wall Street Journal reports. According to a report published Saturday, the Pentagon has been preventing Ukraine from deploying U.S.-supplied long-range missiles to target locations within Russia. This limitation stems from a Pentagon approval procedure established as the White House attempts to encourage Putin to participate in negotiations aimed at ending the conflict. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said on Friday that no meeting agenda exists yet for a summit between Putin and Zelensky, despite Putin's readiness to meet once an agenda is prepared. Trump said on Friday he faces a very important decision about imposing massive sanctions or massive tariffs, or doing nothing, adding, "It's your fight." These events highlight ongoing U.S. frustrations with the protracted conflict and challenges in facilitating a negotiated agreement between Moscow and Kiev. I don't think there's frustrations with the protracted conflict and challenges. I think there's challenges in Donald Trump successfully doing anything. The Globe and Mail. Oh, maybe not. U.S. News. Pentagon restricts Ukraine's use of U.S. missiles against Russia. Well, maybe not. We're doing free articles. We're reading free articles. Ooh, Greek translation. Oh, lost my translator. Pentagon has been discreetly limiting, in recent months, the use by Ukraine's armed forces of medium-range missiles launched from the US-made ATACMS system to hit targets on Russian soil, the Wall Street Journal reported on Saturday, citing sources in the U.S. government. According to the newspaper's sources, approval from high-ranking U.S. DoD officials has been required since the spring for the specific use of the systems. Reuters said it was unable to independently verify the information directly. Short and sweet. Ghislaine Maxwell tells Deputy Attorney General she doesn't believe Jeffrey Epstein died by suicide. Ghislaine Maxwell stated in her DOJ interview that she believes Jeffrey Epstein was murdered due to prison mismanagement, not by influential people. Murdered by prison management? Maxwell claimed that a murder could occur for as little as $25 in prison, suggesting internal dynamics rather than external orchestration involved in Epstein's death. It's like the best of both worlds, right? Epstein didn't kill himself, but neither did the rich people who are implicated by his dealings. DOJ findings conclude Epstein died by suicide despite conflicting views, and no evidence was found to support the idea that he was murdered or blackmailed by influential figures. The circumstances of Epstein's death, including malfunctioning cameras and his removal from Suicide Watch, have fueled conspiracy theories despite the DOJ's official stance. Ghislaine Maxwell, 63, participated in several rounds of testimony released by the DOJ on Friday, August 22nd, and discussed Epstein throughout the more than 300 pages of recordings. At one point during her conversation with Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, Maxwell claimed Epstein, who was found dead in his jail cell in August 2019, may have actually died due to an internal situation. In prison where I am, they will kill you, or they will pay. Somebody can pay a prisoner to kill you for $25 worth of commissary, Maxwell told Blanche. That's about the going rate for a hit with a lock today. Maxwell also conceded it was possible that someone outside the prison would have wanted Epstein dead. But I don't know of any reason why, and I don't believe in the blackmail or in any of this. I don't think Epstein had a hit on like that, she explained. If it is indeed murder, I believe it was an internal situation. She claimed that if someone wanted to kill Epstein, they could have done so before he was sent to prison in July 2019. I also think it's ludicrous because I also happen to think if that is what they wanted, they would have had plenty of opportunity when he wasn't in jail, Maxwell said. And if they were worried about blackmail or anything from him, he would have been a very easy target. Epstein was arrested on federal charges in 2019 for the sex trafficking of minors in Florida and New York. A medical examiner ruled that he died by suicide that summer. In 2022, Maxwell was sentenced to 20 years in prison for conspiring with Epstein to sexually abuse minors. Today's sentence holds Ghislaine Maxwell accountable for perpetrating heinous crimes against children, U.S. Attorney Damian Williams said in a DOJ statement at the time. This sentence sends a strong message that no one is above the law and it is never too late for justice. We again express our gratitude to Epstein and Maxwell's victims for their courage in coming forward, in testifying at trial, and in sharing their stories as part of today's sentencing. Maxwell is currently imprisoned at the same lower security institution in Texas that houses Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes and Real Housewives of Salt Lake City alum Jen Shah. Holmes is currently serving an 11-year sentence for fraud, and Shah is serving her own 6.5-year sentence for wire fraud. Maxwell was moved to the Texas facility after meeting with Blanche. She has also noted via her attorney that she would be willing to testify about her and Epstein's crimes to Congress if granted immunity from President Donald Trump. Well, I'm allowed to give her a pardon, but nobody's approached me with it. Nobody's asked me about it, the president told reporters in July. It's in the news about that aspect of it, but right now it would be inappropriate to talk about. End of tariffs exemption erodes overseas mail to U.S. On August 23rd, Poste Italiane and several other European postal services suspended shipments containing goods to the United States. This suspension follows pending changes to U.S. tariff policies ending the de minimis exemption on August 29th, affecting packages under $800 duty-free. Postal operators cite unclear rules on duties collection, required data, and short preparation times, causing disruptions across Germany, Italy, France, Austria, and the UK. Wow, we're just on a roll, aren't we? In 2024, 1.36 billion packages valued at $64.6 billion arrived duty-free under the exemption, which the White House called a catastrophic loophole. It's the exemption for any imports under $800 are non-tariffed. They're considered too small to bother with. But there's an executive order that just ended that, and I guess it takes effect on the 29th. These pauses may delay shipments to the U.S. and reflect unresolved logistics challenges as European postal services seek clarity on implementing the new tariffs. U.S. judge in Hawaii considers legality of restrictions on access to abortion medication. In 2017, a physician from Hawaii, along with medical organizations, filed a lawsuit in Honolulu disputing the FDA's limitations on the abortion drug mifepristone. A physician from Hawaii disputed the FDA's limitations. Okay. The case arises... When did we do away with... Roe v. Wade. 2022. June of 2022. So the FDA limited the abortion drug mifepristone in 2017. The case arises from FDA rules requiring special certification for prescribers and pharmacies, plus patients signing a counseling form despite past removal of the in-person pickup rule. The ACLU argues that these FDA restrictions disproportionately burden patients who face healthcare access challenges, especially low-income and rural individuals. Washington and 16 other states filed a citizen petition providing data on mifepristone safety, citing nearly 30,000 medication abortions in Washington with under 0.2% severe complications. It's at 30, 1, 2, 3 times 0.002. 60 severe complications out of 30,000 medical abortions. The ongoing legal and political actions suggest continued debate over FDA policies could affect access to medication abortion nationwide under current federal regulations. The U.S. FDA continues to overly restrict access to mifepristone, a medication for abortions and miscarriage management, a lawyer for the ACLU argued Friday in a lawsuit by a Hawaii doctor and health care associations challenging the legality of the restrictions. Wait, this article was yesterday. They are asking a judge to find the FDA violated the law by restricting a safe medication without scientific justification, but stops short of flat out seeking an immediate elimination of the restrictions, which currently include special certification for prescribers and pharmacies and require patients to review a counseling form. Plaintiffs are taking the more modest approach to give the agency an opportunity to correct its errors, Julia Kay, senior staff attorney with the ACLU Reproductive Freedom Project, said in court. U.S. District Judge Jill Otake in Honolulu didn't say when she would issue a ruling. Friday's hearing comes as the pill used in most U.S. abortions continues to be ensnared in politics that have plagued it for nearly a decade, with many wondering if it will be further restricted under President Donald Trump's Republican administration. The case dates to 2017 and has spanned both Republican and Democratic administrations. All along, the FDA has dug its heels in and attempted to justify these extreme restrictions without ever providing a credible justification. Kay told the Associated Press ahead of the hearing, and in the face of a mountain of scientific evidence confirming the safety. Kay noted that during former President Joe Biden's administration, the FDA concluded that requiring the pill to be picked up in person didn't provide a safety benefit and that the requirement should be lifted. The original lead plaintiff was a doctor on Kauai, where he had some colleagues who opposed abortion. At the same time, a key restriction required patients to pick up the medication in person at the hospital, clinic, or medical office, which meant the doctor would have had to involve many of his colleagues in order to stock and dispense the medication, Kay said. The key barrier was eventually removed, and the pill can be sent through the mail. The original doctor left Hawaii, and the lawsuit continues to focus on the remaining restrictions that the ACLU says, in a court filing, disproportionately impact patients who already face difficulties accessing health care, such as those who are low income or live in rural areas. Rural areas, who live in rural areas. Rural areas. Attorneys with the U.S. Department of Justice say in court documents that the FDA has already reduced the burden by removing the in-person dispensing requirement. The FDA's statements about the safety of mifepristone are contingent upon the restrictions being in place, Noah Katzen, an attorney representing the Justice Department, said in court Friday. He also disputed that the plaintiffs, including another Kauai... Is that just another way to spell Hawaii? Is that like the native way to spell Hawaii? No, it's just one of the Hawaiian Islands. Kaua' is one of the islands of Hawaii. Yeah, okay. Katzen declined to comment to the AP after the hearing. Hawaii law allows abortion until a fetus would be viable outside the womb. After that, it's legal if a patient's life or health is in danger. The state legalized abortion in 1970 when it became the first in the nation to allow the procedure at a woman's request. For better and worse, the FDA's policy on medication abortion impacts patients in every state in the nation, including states where abortion is legally protected. Yep. Oh, here's a fun one. Hurricane Center deploys AI to track storm formations. AI is being integrated into weather forecasting systems at the U.S. National Hurricane Center and the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasts. An AI model trained on decades of real-world weather data can predict hurricane movements effectively. Machine learning models allow for quick data integration, reconfiguration, and retraining within days. Experts highlight the urgent need for better forecasting systems to enable mitigation efforts. U.S. National Hurricane Center. Fernand. Tropical Storm Fernand. Heading north at 15 miles an hour. So how do we find the National Hurricane Center AI forecasts?
The National Hurricane Center is partnering with Google to test artificial intelligence hurricane forecast models this season. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the project provides near real-time AI tropical cyclone forecasts to NHC forecasters. They can evaluate the outputs and integrate them into official guidance. The National Hurricane Center says the partnership will...
So we won't have access to the actual AI forecasts. They're just going to use the forecast to integrate into their general guidance that they distribute.
Put new models in the hands of the NHC forecasters who directly communicate hazard risk to the public and partners to enable life-saving actions. Mark DeMaria, senior scientist at the Cooperative Institute for Research in the Atmosphere, says the AI models are already showing 15 to 20% improvement in predicting storm tracks compared with traditional methods. These newer models can provide guidance up to 10 to 15 days in advance, but intensity forecasts remain a work in progress.
Up until just recently, they weren't very good at telling you how strong a storm is going to be when it gets there. They didn't really have enough of the training information, but that's also changing now as well. With the latest model, the Google DeepMind, they really emphasized trying to get the intensity right as well as the track right. And we're working pretty closely with them to validate those in the 2025 hurricane season.
While today's newer models are cutting-edge, simpler AI techniques have been used in forecasting for decades. The new models being tested today represent a major leap forward compared to methods from 20 to 30 years ago. DeMaria says the newer AI techniques have only been around 3 or 4 years.
There's so much more that the forecasters do than just put some numbers down at the table. And so I think this will help them identify where a storm's going to go and maybe map out the uncertainty a little bit more. So I think there's going to be a role for the human forecasters for the foreseeable future. They'll just have better tools.
And while AI is helping improve forecasts, meteorologists remain the final authority on storm warnings and evacuation decisions.
Despite the red carpet,
what does the BLS employment by industry monthly changes data mean? Okay. Federalist number 11. Let's finish this guy. And here's where we left off. A mature consideration of the objects suggested by these questions will justify a belief that the real disadvantages to Britain from such a state of things, conspiring with the prepossessions of a great part of the nation in favor of the American trade, and with the importunities of the West India Islands, would produce a relaxation in our present system, and would let us into the enjoyment of privileges in the markets of those islands elsewhere, from which our trade would derive the most substantial benefits. Such a point gained from the British government, and which could not be expected without an equivalent in exemptions and immunities in our markets, would be likely to have a correspondent effect on the conduct of other nations, who would not be inclined to see themselves altogether supplanted in our trade. A further resource for influencing the conduct of European nations towards us, in this respect, would arise from the establishment of a federal navy. There can be no doubt that the continuance of the Union under an efficient government would put it in our power, at a period not yet very distant, to create a navy which, if it could not vie with those of the great maritime powers, would at least be of respectable weight if thrown into the scale of either of two contending parties. This would be more peculiarly the case in relation to operations in the West Indies. A few ships of the line, sent opportunely to the reinforcement of either side, would be sufficient to decide the fate of a campaign, on the event of which interests of the greatest magnitude were suspended. Our position is, in this respect, a most commanding one. And if to this consideration we add that of the usefulness of supplies from this country in the prosecution of military operations in the West Indies, it will readily be perceived that a situation so favorable would enable us to bargain with great advantage for commercial privileges. A price would be set not only upon our friendship, but upon our neutrality. By a steady adherence to the Union, we may hope ere long to become the arbiter of Europe in America, and to be able to incline the balance of European competitions in this part of the world as our interest may dictate. But in the reverse of this eligible situation, we shall discover that the rivalships of the parts would make them checks upon each other, and would frustrate all the tempting advantages which nature has kindly placed within our reach. In a state so insignificant, our commerce would be a prey to the wanton intermeddlings of all nations at war with each other, who, having nothing to fear from us, would with little scruple or remorse supply their wants by depredations on our property as often as it fell their way. The rights of neutrality will only be respected when they are defended by an adequate power. A nation, despicable by its weakness, forfeits even the privilege of being neutral. Under a vigorous national government, the natural strength and resources of the country, directed to a common interest, would baffle all the combinations of European jealousy to restrain our growth. This situation would even take away the motive to such combinations by inducing an impracticability of success. An active commerce, an extensive navigation, and a flourishing marine would then be the offspring of moral and physical necessity. We might defy the little arts of the little politicians to control or vary the irresistible and unchangeable course of nature. But in a state of disunion, these combinations might exist and might operate with success. It would be in the power of the maritime nations, availing themselves of our universal impotence, to prescribe the conditions of our political existence, and as they have a common interest in being our carriers, and still more in preventing our becoming theirs, they would in all probability combine to embarrass our navigation in such a manner as would in effect destroy it, and continue us to a passive commerce. We should be then compelled to content ourselves with the first price of our commodities, and to see the profits of our trade snatched from us to enrich our enemies and prosecutors. That unequaled spirit of enterprise, which signalizes the genius of the American merchants and navigators, and which is in itself an inexhaustible mine of national wealth, would be stifled and lost. and poverty and disgrace would overspread a country which, with wisdom, might make herself the admiration and envy of the world. There are rights of great moment to the trade of America which are rights of the Union. I allude to the fisheries, to the navigation of the western lakes, and to that of the Mississippi. The dissolution of the Confederacy would give room for delicate questions concerning the future existence of these rights, which the interest of more powerful partners would hardly fail to solve to our advantage. The disposition of Spain with regard to the Mississippi needs no comment. France and Britain are concerned with us in the fisheries and view them as of the utmost moment to their navigation. They, of course, would hardly remain long indifferent to that decided mastery, of which experience has shown us to be possessed in this valuable branch of traffic, and by which we are able to undersell those nations in their own markets. What more natural than that they should be disposed to exclude from the lists such dangerous competitors? This branch of trade ought not to be considered as a partial benefit. All the navigating states may, in different degrees, advantageously participate in it, and under circumstances of a greater extension of mercantile capital, would not be unlikely to do it. As a nursery of seamen it now is, or when time shall have more nearly assimilated the principles of navigation in the several states will become a universal resource. To the establishment of a navy it must be indispensable. To this great national object, a navy, union will contribute in various ways. Every institution will grow and flourish in proportion to the quantity and extent of the means concentrated towards its formation and support. A navy of the United States, as it would embrace the resources of all, is an object far less remote than a navy of any single state or partial confederacy, which would only embrace the resources of a single part. It happens indeed that different portions of confederated America possess each some peculiar advantage for this essential establishment. The more southern states furnish in greater abundance certain kinds of naval stores, tar, pitch, and turpentine. Their wood for the construction of ships is also of a more solid and lasting texture. The difference in the duration of the ships which the navy might be composed, if chiefly constructed of southern wood, would be of signal importance, either in the view of naval strength or of national economy. Some of the southern and of the middle states yield a greater plenty of iron and of better quality. Seamen must chiefly be drawn from the northern hive. The necessity of naval protection to external or maritime commerce does not require a particular elucidation, no more than the conduciveness of that species of commerce to the prosperity of a navy. An unrestrained intercourse between the states themselves will advance the trade of each by an interchange of their respective productions, not only for the supply of reciprocal wants at home, but for exportation to foreign markets. The veins of commerce in every part will be replenished, and will acquire additional motion and vigor from a free circulation of the commodities of every part. Commercial enterprise will have much greater scope from the diversity in the productions of different states. When the staple of one falls from a bad harvest or unproductive crop, it can call to its aid the staple of another. The variety, not less than the value, of products for exportation contributes to the activity of foreign commerce. It can be conducted upon much better terms with a large number of materials of given value than with a small number of materials of the same value, arising from the competitions of trade and from fluctuations of markets. Particular articles may be in great demand at certain periods and unsaleable at others. But if there be a variety of articles, it can scarcely happen that they should all be at one time in the latter predicament, and on this account the operations of the merchant would be less liable to any considerable obstruction or stagnation. The speculative trader will at once perceive the force of these observations, and will acknowledge that the aggregate balance of the commerce of the United States would bid fair to be much more favorable than that of the 13 states without union or with partial unions. So strength and diversity. Many states joined together as one can help bolster each other with their different strengths, covering each other's weaknesses. Makes sense. It may perhaps be replied to this that whether the states are united or disunited, there would still be an intimate intercourse between them which would answer the same ends. This intercourse would be fettered, interrupted, and narrowed by a multiplicity of causes which in the course of these papers have been amply detailed. A unity of commercial as well as political interests can only result from a unity of government. There are other points of view in which this subject might be placed of a striking and animating kind, but they would lead us too far into the regions of futurity and would involve topics not proper for a newspaper discussion. I shall briefly observe that our situation invites and our interests prompt us to aim at an ascendant in the system of American affairs. The world may politically as well as geographically be divided into 4 parts, each having a distinct set of interests. Unhappily for the other 3, Europe, by her arms and by her negotiations, by force and by fraud, has in different degrees extended her dominion over all of them. Africa, Asia, and America have successively felt her domination. The superiority she has long maintained has tempted her to plume herself as the mistress of the world, and to consider the rest of mankind as created for her benefit. Men admired as profound philosophers have, in direct terms, attributed to her inhabitants a physical superiority, and have gravely asserted that all animals, and with them the human species, degenerate in America, that even dogs cease to bark after having breathed a while in our atmosphere. Facts have too long supported these arrogant pretensions of the Europeans. It belongs to us to vindicate the honor of the human race, and to teach that assuming brother moderation. Union will enable us to do it. Disunion will add another victim to his triumphs. Let Americans disdain to be the instruments of European greatness. Let the 13 states, bound together in a strict and indissoluble union, concur in erecting one great American system, superior to the control of all transatlantic force or influence, and able to dictate the terms of the connection between the old and the new world. Publius. Okay. All right, this is Original Meanings, Politics and Ideas in the Making of the Constitution, written by Jack N. Rakove, Pulitzer Prize winner, 1997. From abortion to same-sex marriage, today's most urgent political debates will hinge on this 2-part question. What did the U.S. Constitution originally mean, and who now understands its meaning best? Rakove chronicles the Constitution from inception to ratification, and in doing so traces its complex weave of ideology and interest, showing how this document has meant different things at different times to different groups of Americans. Ideas or interests, these are the classic, if hackneyed antimonies upon which much of the debate over the political and intellectual history of the entire revolutionary era has long been conducted. It is not difficult to see how both affected the deliberations at Philadelphia in 1787. What is elusive is the interplay between them. Some of the arguments the framers advanced were doubtless designed to were doubtless designed to legitimate positions rooted in calculations of state or regional or class interest. Others carried deeper conviction on their merits as attempts to resolve issues that were avowedly related to problems of constitutional theory broadly considered. The true task is thus to find the middle ground, a Madisonian metaphor, between the clouded heights of principle and the familiar terrain of specific interests. Yet precisely because these higher principles often prove difficult to instill from the political maneuvers or elliptical discussions of the convention, many students of the original meaning of the Constitution prefer to give equal or even greater weight to the commentaries and debates of the ratification campaign. Foremost among these sources are the essays of the Federalist, whose sway over modern scholarship begs explanation in its own right. But for all its virtues, the Federalist presents only one facet of the wide-ranging debate that erupted within the publication of the Constitution. Nothing like the extraordinary mobilization of public interest the Constitution evoked had been seen since the crisis of independence a full decade earlier. Ratification, it might be argued, created more than a new framework of national governance. It also demonstrated the possibility of national politics, anticipating the equally noteworthy innovations that enabled Americans, against their expectations, to create effective political parties within a few years. The records of the ratification campaign are more diverse than those of the Federal Convention. They consist of pamphlets and newspaper essays written to influence public opinion, private letters assessing both the Constitution and the changing state of politics, and the records of debates in the state conventions, whose assent alone gave the Constitution its ultimate legal force. This corpus of material can be put to two general uses. First, the ratification records occasionally provide useful evidence bearing on the prior deliberations at Philadelphia. Individual framers were often asked to explain why the convention had acted in one way or declined to act in another. Sometimes their responses add significantly to our knowledge of the original debates at Philadelphia. Moreover, the arguments that these framers advanced in support of the Constitution might reflect reliable impressions or summaries of the considerations they felt had prevailed at Philadelphia, and thus attest to the original intentions underlying the text. Certainly some of the respect the Federalist commands is due not only to its lucid, comprehensive treatment of the Constitution, but also to the privileged position its two principal authors, Madison and Hamilton, held as leading framers. Far more important, however, is the second use to which the ratification records can be put. Taken as a whole, they provide our best evidence of how the Constitution and its provisions were understood at the moment of adoption. Again, this understanding, or these understandings, cannot be equated with the authorial intentions that gave the Constitution its actual content. It is entirely possible, even probable, indeed almost certain, that the intentions of the framers and the understandings of the ratifiers and their electors diverged in numerous ways, on points both major and minor. Given the highly charged and intensely political character of the ratification campaign, no other outcome was possible. True, the Federalist supporters of the Constitution had a natural incentive to rally around the most effective explanations for particular clauses, and thus to foster a measure of consensus as to their meaning. But their anti-Federalist opponents could freely credit any objection their imaginations could conjure, no matter how wild. Some of their predictions echoed the hyperbole of 18th century political rhetoric, and Federalists cited this extravagance and the inconsistencies in the anti-Federalist brief against the Constitution to prove that their opponents were unreasoning and overwrought. Many historians have shared that view. Yet, whether extravagant or plausible, anti-Federalist fears were part of the original understanding of the Constitution, not only in their own right, but also because they influenced the arguments that were made in its support. Huh. Our reconstruction of the original understandings of the Constitution, then, cannot be divorced from the political context of the ratification struggle. This does not mean that we should dismiss all statements on either side of the question as so much propaganda, but it does require an evaluation of the expedient needs that particular arguments were made to serve. For both parties, the overriding imperative was to determine whether the Constitution would be adopted, not to formulate definitive interpretations of its individual clauses. Thus, while arguments about particular provisions mattered a great deal, in the end, the sole decision the ratifiers took was that of approving the Constitution as proposed or rejecting it. One of the things the Federalists argued was that the Constitution was there to be accepted or rejected. Any issues that anybody had with the Constitution could be addressed in subsequent amendments. So ratify or don't ratify. If you ratify, you can amend, but we're not amending it and then ratifying it. For both parties, the overriding imperative was to determine whether the Constitution would be adopted, not to formulate definitive interpretations of its individual clauses. Thus, while arguments about particular provisions mattered a great deal, in the end, the sole decision the ratifiers took was that of approving the Constitution as proposed or rejecting it. The only understanding we can be entirely confident the majority of ratifiers shared was that they were indeed deciding whether the Constitution would form a more perfect union than the Articles of Confederation, even if it no longer claimed, as had the Articles, that this union would be perpetual. Huh. Our knowledge of what the ratifiers understood they were adopting is further limited by the spotty character of the reporting of the debates at the state conventions and the obscurity of their members. Though a few speeches were reported in more detail than Madison provided in his corresponding efforts at Philadelphia, none of the records of the state conventions, with the possible exception of Virginia, match his notes in quality and breadth. Yet, notwithstanding their deficiencies, these records deserve careful scrutiny for one crucial reason that is, however, related more to questions of law than to those of history. Madison stated the key point in 1796 when he argued that questions about the meaning of the Constitution could be answered in the light of the debates over ratification, but not by consulting the intentions of the framers at Philadelphia. Huh. So Madison argued that if you wanted to really understand what the Constitution means, you should, rather than simply reading the Constitution, is hear how they argued for it. Whatever veneration might be entertained for the body of men who formed our Constitution, he told the House of Representatives, the sense of that body could never be regarded as the oracular guide in expounding the Constitution. As the instrument came from them, it was nothing more than the draft of a plan, nothing but a dead letter, until life and validity were breathed into it by the voice of the people, speaking through the several state conventions. If we were to look, therefore, for meaning of the instrument beyond the face of the instrument, we must look for it not in the general convention which proposed, but in the state conventions which accepted and ratified the Constitution. Although Madison had serious problems explaining how the views of the latter were to be ascertained, his position has at least this in its favor. It is fully consistent with the theory of popular sovereignty that was itself one of the great rallying points of Federalist arguments in 1787 and 88. The Constitution had become supreme law not because it was proposed by the Federal Convention of 1787, but because it was ratified by the state conventions of 1787 through 88. Yeah, that's true. It didn't become law because they wrote it. It became law because the country accepted it, because the states accepted it. By this criterion, the intentions of the framers were legally irrelevant to its interpretation, but the understandings of the ratifiers could provide a legitimate basis for attempting to fix the original meaning of the Constitution. Even the most intensive examination of the surviving records for the debates of 1787 and 88 will leave substantial gaps in our knowledge, however. Similarly, the spare language of the Constitution does not make explicit the broader assumptions about government on which it is clearly based. The preamble to the Constitution cannot sustain the close theoretical analysis that has been lavished upon the opening paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence. To fill these gaps in the record and the silences of the Constitution, many scholars have sought to reconstruct the larger intellectual context that shaped the contours of American thought in the late 18th century. That thought and the Constitution it produced were expressions of the Enlightenment. There can be no question that the framers and many of their contemporaries were familiar not only with the great works of such luminaries as Locke, Hobbes, Montesquieu, Hume, and Blackstone, but also with the richly polemical literature of 17th and 18th century English politics, the moral philosophy and social science of the Scottish Enlightenment, and the disquisitions on public law of such respected European authorities such as Grotius, Pufendorf, and Delaunay. Moreover, it is clear that general historical reading informed the way in which 18th century Americans thought about politics. When they spoke of learning from experience, they did not mean their own so much as that of previous generations, running all the way back to classical antiquity. All of these writings were somehow part of the intellectual universe the framers inhabited. Yet again, their application to the interpretation of the Constitution poses difficult problems. All of these writings were somehow part of the intellectual universe the framers inhabited. Yet again, their application to the interpretation of the Constitution poses difficult problems. Perhaps the most vexatious involves tracing the lines of influence between these authorities and their American audience. At certain points, it is clear, quite specific connections can be made. The way in which Hamilton and Madison both invoke the celebrated Montesquieu to introduce their respective discussions of the extended republic and the separation of powers in the Federalist, Essays 9 and 47, we read 9, demonstrates the authoritative status that the French baron's treatise De l'Esprit de Louis commanded. Much has been made, too, of the inspiration that Madison found in David Hume's essay, Idea of a Perfect Commonwealth, as he sought to counter the familiar view that the republican form of government was suitable only for small and homogeneous societies like the city-states of antiquity. Idea of a Perfect Commonwealth. Okay. Or again, the Federal Convention's first discussion of executive power on June 1st, 1787, presupposes a knowledge of William Blackstone's treatment of royal prerogative in his commentaries on the laws of England. Yet it is no easy matter to link specific provisions of the Constitution with the writings of prior authorities. The problem lies in a distinction that Americans at every level of politics understood, that between fundamental principles of government on the one hand and the actual forms that any individual government can take. Oh, there's distinctions between those two things. On the principles of government, a broad consensus reigned. Government existed for the good of the many and to protect the liberty, property, and equal rights of the citizen. The idea that representation would help the government to determine the common good was commonplace, and so was the belief that separation of powers was essential to the protection of rights. These and other principles were reiterated in all the political writings in which Americans were steeped. Their authority was axiomatic. Axioms alone, however, stand by. Axioms alone, however, do not solve problems. Specific calculations are always needed to derive the desired results. In practice, the entire enterprise of constitution making in revolutionary America centered on determining which forms of Republican government were best suited to securing the general principles all accepted. Decisions about forms touched such prosaic questions as the respective powers and privileges of the different branches of government or the two houses of a legislature. Decisions about forms touch such prosaic questions as the respective powers and privileges of the different branches of government or the two houses of a legislature, the basis of representation, terms of office, modes of election, and so on. Though statements by Hume or Montesquieu or Blackstone or Harrington occasionally seemed pertinent to a particular problem, more often a wide number of solutions could be made compatible with the first principles of republicanism. From their reading, the framers of the Constitution could extract no simple formulas to determine the exact form of the new government. No simple formulas to determine the exact form of the new government. Could extract no simple formulas to determine the exact form that the new government should take. The intellectual world of the Enlightenment, then, provides only a general context within which the Constitution can be located. Though clearly important in its own right, it cannot readily be brought to bear to solve particular puzzles of constitutional meaning. There is, however, a far broader context within which these writings can be located, and which in turn provides the true framework for recovering what was both original and derivative in the intentions and understandings of 1787 to 88. For the adoption of the federal Constitution culminated a century and a half of constitutional controversy, contestation, and innovation that gave the American revolutionaries a richly complicated legacy of ideas and practices from which to construct their new Republican polity. That's interesting. With a modest risk of oversimplification, this prior history can be divided into four substantial phases. It is evident, first, that the vocabulary of American constitutional thinking was profoundly shaped by the great disputes between the Stuart monarchs and their opponents. In Parliament and out, which reached a momentous climax in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 89, on a host of issues ranging from the great paradigms of mixed government and separation of powers to the inestimable right to trial by jury. The contending positions of the Stuart era were still vividly recalled a full century later. What is the Stuart era? Stuart monarchs. The Stuart dynasty. Whoa. The Stuarts were the first kings of the United Kingdom. Oh. King James VI of Scotland became King James I of England. Reigned from 1603 through 1714. age of intense religious debate and radical politics. Both contributed to a bloody civil war in the mid-17th century between Crown and Parliament, resulting in a parliamentary victory for Oliver Cromwell and the dramatic execution of King Charles I. Revolution. Profoundly shaped by the great disputes between the Stuart monarchs and their opponents. Both parliamentary opponents and non-parliamentary opponents. Reached a momentous climax in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, in which King James II was deposed and his daughter was put in place, along with her Dutch husband. On a host of issues, ranging from the great paradigms of mixed government and separation of powers to the inestimable right to trial by jury, the contending positions of the Stuart era were still vividly recalled a full century later. These positions remained vital, in the second place, because the structure of colonial politics gave 17th century arguments a continuing vitality in 18th century America. Colonists naturally regarded their own legislative assemblies as miniatures of the mother parliament, and the provincial elites who ruled there sought to acquire for these bodies the same rights and privileges that the House of Commons had struggled so long to acquire or regain if one clung to the belief that the Norman conquest of 1066 had deprived England of its ancient constitution of Gothic liberty. The recurrence in the colonies of these classic quarrels between executive prerogative and the legislative privilege made Americans receptive not only to the general principles that Locke had enshrined in his second treatise, but also to the works of more obscure but equally impassioned writers who preserved the radical edge of 17th century polemics amid the complacency of Georgian Britain. Third, the imperial controversy that began with the Stamp Act of 1765 and ended with the Declaration of Independence sharpened the colonists' understanding of the striking differences between their own political practices and the practices and attitudes and those prevailing at home in Britain. These differences seemed most conspicuous in the practice of representation, but they were evident as well in the colonists' rejection of monarchy, aristocracy, and much, if not all, of the theory of mixed government. Mixed monarchy and republicanism, I guess. Representative. Fourth, and arguably most important, independence necessitated the reconstitution of legal government within all the states, save the corporate colonies of Rhode Island and Connecticut, and it thus gave rise to the experiment in republicanism that the past generation of scholars has explored in such great detail. The adoption of written constitutions of government in the mid-1770s was in one sense a wonderful accident made possible by the literal-minded way in which the colonists believed the collapse of royal government and the eruption of civil war had reduced them to something like a state of nature. But it also gave them the opportunity to establish new and superior forms of government, more in tune with the conditions of American society and Republican principles. And once established, the operations of these state governments in turn provided the most visible examples of what republicanism meant in practice. Their failings not only drove the movement for constitutional reform that brought the framers to Philadelphia in May 1787, they also provided the experimental evidence upon which the convention drew as it sought to fashion an improved model of Republican government. For the convention delegates of 1787 to 88 came to their task fresh, not from research in their studies, but from the business of managing a revolution and conducting public affairs at every level of government. Conscious as they were of the fate of other republics and confederacies, ancient and modern, the lessons of the past that they weighed most heavily were drawn from their own experience. That's a good point. Yet if this decade of constitutional experimentation was the greatest influence on the debates of 1787 and 88, principles and lessons inculcated over the previous century and a half were not simply sloughed off as the detritus of an irrelevant pre-revolutionary ancient regime. Americans were as eclectic in their use of history as they were in their often selective reading of texts and authorities. Reconstructing how they reasoned about the great questions of the late 1780s may therefore require a review, in highly synthesized form, of aspects of Anglo-American politics and political theory that long predate the immediate debates over the Constitution. No simple formula or code can map how these strands of thought came together in 1787 and 88. Like any other historical effort to explain how texts emerge from contexts, the recovery of original meanings, intentions, and understandings is itself an act of interpretation, but one that can at least be bounded, though not perfected, by canons of scholarship. Some may object that too great an emphasis on establishing the multiple contexts within which the framers and ratifiers acted risks historicizing the great moment of the founding, reducing its profound expressions of principle to the prosaic level of mere interest and ideology, and subordinating its transcendent meaning in favor of a time-bound portrait of an 18th century society that remains irretrievably lost and alien. Against these charges, historians can respond in at least two ways. They can plead necessity, the evidence allows no other choice. Our knowledge of the complexity of political controversy and debate during this period can sustain no other conclusion. Or they can plead innocence, far from treating the political thought of the Revolutionary era as the mere product of a fevered ideology. The most important recent historical writing goes to great lengths to describe its originality and creativity. But it does so not by abstracting these creative acts and ideas from the circumstances of their origination, but by exploring and explaining the relation between them. Ultimately, of course, historians, political theorists, and legal scholars diverge in their approaches because they pose different questions and seek different answers. Working historians should have no illusions about their capacity to correct, much less prevent, the errors to which their colleagues seem prone. Nor should historians be surprised when their findings are put to uses they never intended or even contemplated. Surely J.G.A. Pocock, Bernard Bailyn, and Gordon Wood never imagined that their reconstruction of the early modern ideology of republicanism would provide the conceptual foundation upon which an entire school of legal scholars soon launched a Republican revival of their own, in the process fashioning an originalism of the communitarian left to challenge the originalism of the new and Republican right. The forms of historical argumentation employed by both the right and the left margins of contemporary scholarship and politics are not driven, of course, by the historian's old-fashioned and perhaps naive desire to get the story right for its own sake. They represent, instead, only another chapter in the saga of the American search for a usable past. Historians certainly help this search to go forward, but they may also suggest why its goal is and should remain elusive. By taking the problem of originalism seriously, by considering the uses and potential misuses of different forms of evidence, it may be possible to advance a debate that is very much about a specific moment in history, but is not about history alone. Okay. My viewer, my lovely viewer, it is time for me to log off. Thanks for joining. We'll see you next time. Have